What is up, everyone? This is Nate Morris, MasterLSAT.com, and in this video, we're going to master questions 11 through 20 from the logical reasoning section of the May 2020 LSAT-Flex. So if you haven't already taken that test, go ahead and follow the link in the description below, try it first on your own, and then we'll master all the questions you had trouble with together. For each question, we start by going over the paragraph and figuring out what to look for in the answer choices, then we individually analyze each answer choice. You can use the timestamps below to jump in between questions. Number 11, which of the following is most strongly supported? If all the above is true, which of the following must be true? So it says in the past, infants that weren't breastfed were fed cow's milk. Doctors at a certain point began advising that we boil the cow's milk to sterilize it and prevent infections. Once we started doing that, once they started boiling the cow's milk that they were giving to infants, there was all of a sudden an alarming increase among infants in the incidence of scurvy, which is caused by a deficiency in vitamin C. Breastfed infants, however, didn't contract scurvy. Therefore, blank. If this paragraph were finished with the words therefore blank, what would you expect the conclusion to be, the inference, right? If we put two and two together, if when we started boiling cow's milk, the infants that were fed boiled cow's milk all of a sudden started getting scurvy, and scurvy is caused by vitamin C deficiency, it sounds like the boiled cow's milk is somehow causing a vitamin C deficiency. That's not being caused by the breast milk, because it says breastfed infants didn't contract scurvy, so they didn't have a vitamin C deficiency. So that seems to be the most obvious inference here, right? Is that therefore, if we had to make a conclusion here, therefore, boiled cow's milk seems to cause a vitamin C deficiency, which caused the scurvy. So let's look for that or something similar in the answers. A makes perfect sense, right? According to the paragraph, the infants that were given boiled cow's milk got more scurvy, which is caused by a vitamin C deficiency, than the infants that were given mother's milk. And therefore, clearly, A is true, or at least likely true, supported by this paragraph, to say, therefore, clearly boiled cow's milk is somehow making less vitamin C available to these infants than does the same amount of the mother's breast milk, right? This is the easiest conclusion to make. If the paragraph is true, it sounds that therefore A is true also, because otherwise, why would these kids be getting scurvy, and why would those kids not be getting scurvy? So A makes perfect sense. B, we don't know if this is true, right? It says that the doctors recommended that we boil the cow's milk to sterilize the milk and prevent gastrointestinal infections, but that doesn't mean that B, that infants who consume unboiled cow's milk frequently contract these fatal infections, right? Maybe it's not frequent. Maybe it's extremely infrequent. Maybe it's a 1 in 1,000 chance, but even on a 1 in 1,000 chance, right, you might as well boil the milk to prevent that 1 in 1,000 chance of that infection. But again, just because we're boiling it to make it less likely to get the infection doesn't mean that if you don't boil it, it's likely, it's frequent that it happens, right? So therefore, B is not necessarily true. C is not what this paragraph says. It's not the mother's milk that we're worried about causing the infections. The paragraph says the cow's milk is what the doctors are recommending to boil, so that the cow's milk is sterilized and doesn't cause potentially fatal infections, right? According to the paragraph, it seems like with the mother's milk, we don't have to worry about these infections. So C is kind of backwards. D, we certainly don't know that this is true. This doesn't make any sense, that when doctors made this recommendation to boil the cow's milk, they didn't know what scurvy was. They didn't know that scurvy was caused by a deficiency in vitamin C. No, this isn't necessarily true. We have no idea what was going on in their minds, right? Who said that they didn't know what scurvy was? Maybe they knew what scurvy was and what caused it. Maybe they just didn't realize that boiling the cow's milk would cause this vitamin C deficiency that would cause scurvy, right? So there's no evidence that they didn't know what scurvy was. Or maybe they knew that it would cause scurvy, right? Maybe they knew what scurvy was and they knew that boiling the cow's milk would give these kids scurvy, and maybe they're just evil doctors, right? Who knows? There's no evidence of anything going on in the doctor's mind or knowledge base in this question. E, the paragraph never tells us about the proportionality here. What percentage of mothers breastfed their infants versus what percent used cow's milk, right? When doctors made this recommendation, the recommendation was being made to, obviously, to the mothers that weren't breastfeeding their infants. that were fed cow's milk, but it doesn't say whether that was 50% or 75% or 25%. We have no idea whether most mothers were breastfeeding their infants or not, and therefore this is not supported. Number 12, we want to resolve the paradox, the discrepancy. So let's see what the discrepancy is. Grass and brush fires are kept in check by rain, and therefore if the level of rainfall is low for a while, then there are a lot more of these fires. Makes sense so far. But then, here's the discrepancy. Yet, grass and brush fires cause less financial damage overall during periods of severe drought than periods of normal rainfall. We would have expected the opposite based on the first half of the paragraph, because the first half of the paragraph told us that in general, if there is a low level of rain, there are more of these fires. Why does that reverse? This is the discrepancy, is why does drought reverse it, right? In general, low rainfall means more grass and brush fires, which makes sense because the rain stops the fires. So then why, when it's severe drought, we would have expected that to be the most fires, because severe drought means there's no rain at all. Why does it reverse? Why is it actually fewer of these fires, or at least less financial damage caused by these fires when there is drought? So that's the question we want to answer. Why does drought mean less damage caused by fires? We would have expected the opposite. So see what we just did? We just framed it as a question. The question, why? Why is this happening? Why are there fewer fires, or at least less damage caused financially by these fires when there's drought, whereas we would have expected the opposite because rain is a check normally on these fires? So let's look for something that answers that question now that we've clarified what it is. A is about money, it's about funding, but it doesn't answer the question. It just says that the fire departments get less funding when there's drought, which, by the way, makes sense because there are less damages being caused by these fires when there's drought, according to the paragraph. So A makes sense as a function of that, I guess, but it doesn't answer the question of why there are so few fires during drought. It just says the departments get less money, but we don't know why. We haven't answered the question why there are fewer fires, or at least less damage caused by fires. That has nothing to do with the funding. That has to do with the fires, right? So A doesn't answer the question. B definitely doesn't answer the question. It has nothing to do with drought versus non-drought. Remember, the question we're asking here is why are there so few fires, or at least so few damages financially caused by fires during drought? B is comparing areas to each other. It's not comparing drought to non-drought, which is what we want. It's comparing areas that are densely populated versus not densely populated. It says that areas subject to these fires tend to be less densely populated than areas where there aren't these fires. Okay, great, that's an interesting correlation, but it has nothing to do with drought, and it has nothing to do with answering this question of why periods of drought seem to have less financial damage due to these fires. C is very tricky, and a ton of people miss this, but it's exactly what we're looking for. You have to read carefully and you have to think carefully, because even though C doesn't have the word drought in it, it does answer our question. It does tell us why we should expect there to be less damage caused by fires during periods of drought. Because what is C saying? C says the biggest and the hardest to control fires tend to only happen when there is a lot of vegetation to be consumed by the fire. Now, by definition, that is not a period of drought, because a period of drought means there's no rainfall and thus no vegetation, or at least not a lot of vegetation, right? That is just what the definition of drought is. So according to C, when there's no vegetation, you're not going to have any large, hard-to-control grass and brush fires for the most part. Those are only going to happen when there actually is vegetation to be consumed, which, as we know, would not be the case during drought. So if you read C carefully, you'll see that it actually does tell you why periods of drought should see fewer of these fires than when there's no drought. You have to think about what drought means, and the fact that drought means there will be less vegetation, and therefore C makes perfect sense. Again, perfect lesson in reading carefully, not just crossing it off because it doesn't have the word you're expecting, but rather thinking about the idea of what's being said and whether that's relevant. D does not answer our question. It has nothing to do with drought versus non-drought, right? Remember, our question is why do periods of drought have fewer financial damage caused by fires versus periods without drought of normal rainfall? D has nothing to do with comparing those two time periods. D says that grass and brush fires that are not caused by human negligence or arson generally are started by lightning. Okay, who cares? It doesn't answer our question. Our discrepancy of why less damage during drought is not answered at all by this. E doesn't answer our question because, like many of these other wrong answer choices, it has nothing to do with drought versus non-drought. E just says when vegetation is destroyed in one of these fires, whether it's during drought or non-drought, it tends to be replaced by vegetation that is at least as flammable, equally, if not more flammable. So now I understand why when there's a fire in one of these regions, that region then becomes more likely to experience another fire. But it doesn't compare time periods. It doesn't compare drought versus non-drought. This is something that would be true all the time. So it certainly doesn't answer our question. Number 13, we're looking for an assumption required by the argument. The argument says we have this new test that detects certain polyps at an early stage when it's unclear whether they're malignant or not. But because there's a risk that they're malignant, a lot of doctors, in most cases, will have them surgically removed, which is dangerous. Yet, some of these polyps turn out to not be malignant. Thus, therefore, conclusion, this test can prompt dangerous operations that actually are not medically necessary. There's the assumption right there. The whole argument is all in those last couple lines, right? It says some of these polyps turn out to not be malignant. Therefore, these polyps being removed is not medically necessary, right? So we just assume that if it's not malignant, then it's not medically necessary to remove them, right? That's it. Simple as that. No more, no less, right? That's the whole point here. Obviously, if they're malignant, right, the risk that they're malignant leads doctors to surgically remove them, right? But then it says, but some of them are not malignant, therefore we're doing medically unnecessary surgeries. So we assume if support then conclusion, if they're not malignant, we're assuming that that means that it's not medically necessary to remove them. That and only that is required to prove this conclusion. A has nothing to do with our conclusion, right? Because our conclusion, we're just trying to prove that these surgical operations are not medically necessary. A says an operation that's dangerous is only ethically justified if blah, blah, blah is true, if a medical condition is being treated that's more dangerous, right? First of all, this paragraph never compares relative danger of different things, of conditions versus surgery. It just says the surgery is dangerous. But second of all, A is talking about ethical justification, not what this paragraph is about. This conclusion is just trying to prove that they are not medically necessary. A has nothing to do with proving that conclusion. B is exactly what has to be assumed. B says that it's not medically necessary, at least not always medically necessary, to surgically remove non-malignant polyps detected by this test. Exactly, because that was the support in the conclusion. The support is saying that some of these polyps are not malignant, and then the conclusion was saying, therefore, these polyps that are being removed sometimes are not medically necessary to be removed, right? In other words, we're assuming B. We're assuming that since they're non-malignant, it's not medically necessary to remove them. This is exactly what gets us from our support to our conclusion, so it is the missing assumption of this argument. C doesn't have to be assumed. It doesn't make sense because C says if this test does encourage medically unnecessary operations, okay, stop right there because that's the whole conclusion of the argument. We're just trying to argue that that's the case. C says if the conclusion is true, then something else is true. Then probably it either shouldn't be used or we should modify its use. Maybe that's true, but we don't have to assume that for this argument. We are simply trying to prove that this test is encouraging or causing medically unnecessary operations. C is kind of the next step. C is kind of saying, by the way, if that is true, right, if this conclusion is true, then probably we shouldn't be using this test anymore. But that's kind of a different argument for a different day. We're just trying to prove this conclusion, right? What's this conclusion? That the test is encouraging medically unnecessary operations, right? So whether that means that we shouldn't use these tests or we should modify them is not what this argument is about. D is not what this argument is getting at, right? We don't have to assume that a polyp detected from this test should be surgically removed if it is malignant. It kind of seems like that's the case, but that has nothing to do with the conclusion. The conclusion is that if it's not malignant, then it's not medically necessary to remove the polyp surgically. D is a different argument. D is saying if it is malignant, then it should be surgically removed, right? Those two things don't mean the same thing, and this will very frequently be a trick answer lurking on assumption questions, where the argument is kind of saying if X, then Y, and the answer choice says if not X, then not Y. Those are two totally different things, right? So we're trying to argue that if it's not malignant, it doesn't have to be removed. D is saying if it is malignant, then it does have to be removed. Not the same thing. E, we don't have to assume this, that the test is only medically useful when it detects a polyp that requires treatment. Maybe it's useful for other things, right? Maybe this screening test also detects 10 other things other than polyps, right? We have no idea. It never says either way in the paragraph, right? We need to assume that the polyps that are not malignant don't require treatment. They're not medically necessary to remove, right? E says the test is only useful if it detects a polyp that does require treatment. Our whole point here is just to prove that certain polyps don't require treatment, that the non-malignant ones don't require treatment, right? We're not trying to prove whether the test is medically useful or not. So E is not exactly what the conclusion is getting at. Number 14, this was a tricky question. A lot of people missed this. We want to look for something to strengthen the argument. What does the argument say? It says that generally when people speak, their blood pressure goes up, but extroverted people get a milder surge than introverted people. Introverted people, their blood pressure goes up more when they speak, and speaking is more stressful for them. And therefore, says the conclusion, it's probably the stress, the psychological stress of speaking that causes these blood pressure surges rather than the physical exertion of speech production, right? And you know how we know that? Again, the support for that conclusion is because the introverted people, they have more psychological stress and they also have more of a blood pressure surge. So it seems like it's the psychological stress, not the physical exertion of moving your mouth, right? Because presumably that's the same between introverted people versus extroverted people, right? Where they differ is the psychological stress, and therefore we're assuming that that is what causes the blood pressure surges. This makes perfect sense, right? As you may know if you've followed a bunch of my videos, you know that there are sort of two different flavors of strengthen, weaken questions, right? Let's say strengthen the argument questions like this one. Let's isolate strengthen. So there are some arguments that you're given where there's an obvious hole in the argument, right? There's something that doesn't add up. There's a jump, and that's how you know how to predict the answer. You know that that's going to be the thing that has to be strengthened for the argument to make sense. But then there are other questions like this one where the argument is decent. It makes perfect sense. There's no gaping logical hole or jump in the argument, and therefore we don't really know what the answer is going to be because the answer is just going to be new information, right? The argument already makes sense. There's nothing that needs to be strengthened. So therefore, we need to look for new information to add even more fuel to the fire, to strengthen it, to make it even more strong, right? And so therefore, this is one of the types of questions where we shouldn't be afraid of new information, right? Because we need new information. The argument as it is, if we just give something that's already in the paragraph, how could that possibly change the argument or strengthen it, right? So the evidence supports the conclusion pretty well. Let's look for something new that adds even more support to this conclusion that it's the psychological stress of speaking that causes the blood pressure surges rather than the physical exertion. A does not change this argument. A is an unfortunate fact. It says that blood pressure medications don't seem to help. It doesn't seem to keep these people who take them from experiencing these blood pressure fluctuations when they speak, but it has nothing to do with what's causing the blood pressure fluctuations to begin with. A just says that medications don't help with them. But that has nothing to do with what causes them, whether it's the physical exertion of speech or, as we're trying to argue, the psychological stress of speech, right? A has nothing to do with what's causing the surges in the first place. B is an interesting fact to know, but it doesn't change anything. We're trying to argue about what causes the blood pressure surges when you speak. B says, in general, the lower your blood pressure is in general, the more of a surge you are going to get in blood pressure when under stress. Okay. How does that relate to our paragraph? Our paragraph is comparing introverted and extroverted and saying that since introverted people have a greater surge, it's probably caused by psychological stress, right? B doesn't tell you anything about what's causing these blood pressure surges when people speak, right? Notice how B doesn't even mention speech at all, which is what the whole argument is about. B is just a general fact about blood pressure, and it says that in general, the lower your blood pressure is, the more it'll surge when you're under stress, right? Now, that doesn't pertain to our argument because at no point in this argument is it made relevant how generally low or how generally high your blood pressure is. It's only talking about the surges, and it's comparing introverted versus extroverted. It's not comparing generally low blood pressure people to generally high blood pressure people. So this is irrelevant. C is not relevant. C says that the introverted people that don't have chronically high blood pressure, first of all, that's not relevant. Chronically high blood pressure is not shown to have anything to do with anything we've said so far, right? We're just talking about the surges that people get when they speak. Whether those people have chronically high blood pressure, I don't see how that plays in at all. But at any rate, C says that introverted people who don't have chronically high blood pressure tend to sense the rises in blood pressure that they occur that we're speaking about in this paragraph. That's also irrelevant. Who cares whether they sense the rises or not? We're talking about what caused the rises in the first place. Is it psychological stress or is it physical stress, right? C just says some people tend to sense those rises after they happen. Nothing to do with what caused them in the first place. D is not an answer we would have predicted necessarily, but it is 100% consistent with this person's hypothesis. It's consistent with the argument, and therefore it strengthens the argument because it's what we would expect if the argument were true. Remember, the argument is saying that the stress that people feel from speaking emotionally, psychologically, is what causes the blood pressure surge, not the physical exertion. And D is consistent with that because D says when you look at deaf people, when they sign, right, they're not moving their mouths, they're moving their hands. When they sign, meaning when they are doing their version of speaking, which is what we're talking about in this paragraph, according to D, they get that increased blood pressure surge as well, but not if they move their hands in an identical way for some other reason. So according to D, it's not the physical exertion because when you equate the physical exertion, right, but on the one hand they're speaking, they're communicating, and on the other hand they're not, they only get the surge over here, which proves that it must be the psychological stress from communicating. It's not the physical exertion, right? Since they're doing the same thing as speaking, right? The talking that we're talking about in the paragraph, this is the exact equivalent. And so therefore this proves that the emotional stress of speaking, the psychological stress, causes blood pressure surges, right? And therefore that strengthens the argument. It's new information, but again, you never want to be afraid of new information on strength in the argument questions because it has to be something new, right? It can't be something from the paragraph. If we just were to repeat something from the paragraph, how on earth would that strengthen the argument? So it's okay that it's new. You have to think about what it means. And if it's consistent, if it adds evidence to our conclusion, then it is correct. And in this case, it does. So D is correct. E is not shown to be relevant. E says extroverted people are more likely to have chronically high blood pressure than introverted people and are therefore more likely to take blood pressure medication. That doesn't change anything. First of all, why would chronically high blood pressure be relevant to proving what the factor is that causes the blood pressure surges when you speak, right? The fact that they're more likely to have chronically high blood pressure, what does that have to do with this argument? The argument is about what's causing these surges. Is it the physical exertion or is it the psychological stress of speech, right? If anything, I can make an argument that maybe this weakens the argument because it gives me another difference between introverted and extroverted people, right? The paragraph said the difference between introverted and extroverted people vis-a-vis speech and blood pressure is that extroverted people get less stressed out when they speak. So we said, therefore, that's probably why they're getting less of a surge, and therefore it's the stress that's causing the surge. But E gives me another difference between them. Maybe it's the fact that they have chronically high blood pressure. Maybe that's what's causing the surge to be different. Do you see what I'm saying? So if anything, it weakens the argument, certainly doesn't strengthen it. Number 15 is a very tricky question, so let's read it carefully. The conclusion is strongly supported if which of the following is assumed, so we have to try to strengthen this argument. The argument says you should only buy a frying pan that has a warranty, even if you have to pay more, and most notably, even if you are never going to use the warranty, you should still only buy a frying pan that has a warranty. Why? What's the support for that conclusion? Because manufacturers won't offer a warranty if it means that they would have to reimburse a lot of people if the product doesn't work or last. So what does that mean? What's the implication of that sentence? Is that if they did offer a warranty, that means that they won't have to, or at least they don't expect to reimburse many customers, right? If you think about it in terms of contrapositive, right, conditional logic, that's just the contrapositive of that sentence, right? It says, if doing so, right, if the warranty would require them to reimburse many customers, then they won't offer a warranty. That's another way of saying that if they do offer a warranty, that means that the warranty won't require them to reimburse many customers. So basically, according to this sentence we've just read, that a warranty on a frying pan means that the manufacturer does not expect to have to actually pay it out, right? And then the conclusion says, therefore, you should only buy that frying pan, those frying pans that have warranties. Why? Because the manufacturer does not expect to have to use the warranty. So we're assuming that that proves that it's a good quality frying pan, right? That's the assumption. That's the gap between the support and the conclusion. It's a pretty reasonable argument, right? It's saying, well, they wouldn't offer the warranty if they expected to have to pay it out to many people. And it seems that that's pretty solid proof that therefore, at least they expect it to last a long time and to work well, right? So we have to assume that that's the case, though. That is somewhat of a jump, right? We have to assume that the fact that they don't expect to pay it out, we know that if they're offering a warranty, that means they don't expect to pay it out. That's what that last sentence tells us. That's what that support tells us. We have to assume that the fact that they don't expect to pay it out proves that it's a good quality pan, right? Again, the support says warranty proves that they don't expect to have to actually pay it out. And the conclusion says a warranty means that's a frying pan that you should buy. So we're assuming the fact that they don't expect to pay it out proves that it's a good quality frying pan that you should buy. So even though it sounds like it makes pretty good sense, let's look for something in the answer choices that strengthens that connection between those two things a little better. A is very tricky, but it does actually strengthen the argument because it fills in, to some extent, that assumption that we mentioned this argument was making. A fills that assumption in. What was that assumption? Remember, the support of the argument said the manufacturers don't offer these warranties if it means that they'll have to actually pay them out to a lot of people, right? So in other words, the fact that they do offer the warranty means they know they're not going to have to pay the warranty out. And we said that that proves it must be a good pan, right? In other words, they're assuming the fact that these manufacturers don't expect to pay out the warranty proves that it's a good pan. And A says that yes, it does prove that, because A says most of the people that buy these pans, guess what? If the pan didn't work or last long, they'd be cashing in on that warranty. So according to A, the only possible scenario where manufacturers don't have to reimburse many customers is if the pan actually works well, right? Because according to A, if the pan didn't work well, most of the buyers would cash in on the warranty. So the paragraph says, therefore, if the manufacturer offers the warranty and therefore has proven that they don't expect to pay it out, right, that means the pan actually is going to work well and last long. Because according to A, one more time, according to A, if it didn't work well or last long, most of the people who bought it would cash in on the warranty. So therefore, since the warranty proves that they don't expect to pay out the warranty, it means that they know that that's not going to happen. And according to A, it would happen if the pan didn't work well, right? So it strengthens that connection between knowing that they don't expect to pay it out. According to A, that proves that they know the pan will actually work well and last long. It's very tricky. It's a very convoluted line of logic, but it makes perfect sense. And perhaps to demonstrate it slightly more clearly, let's imagine the opposite, right? Sometimes it's easier to think about it from the other perspective. If A strengthens the argument, then that would have to mean that the opposite of A would weaken the argument, right? That's always a litmus test you can apply. Sometimes it makes questions like this strengthen the argument questions where the answer doesn't really seem so obvious. It makes it a little easier because sometimes it's easier to see from the other perspective. So if something strengthens the argument, then the opposite would have to weaken it. Is that true for A? The answer is yes, because let's think about the opposite of A. A says most people who buy a frying pan, if the pan ends up not panning out, pardon the pun please, they will end up cashing in on the warranty. That's what A says. The people who buy frying pans are actually going to use those warranties. Well, let's imagine the opposite of that is true. Let's imagine instead of most people, let's imagine it's nobody. Nobody does it, right? That's the opposite of what A is saying. A is saying almost everybody who buys these pans cash in on these warranties. Let's imagine the opposite of A was true. Nobody who buys frying pans ever even dreams of cashing in on the warranty. They don't even know there's a warranty, and even if the pan stops working, they probably forgot that it even had a warranty. Well, that would weaken the argument, right? That totally destroys the premise of the argument, because the argument was saying that the fact that the manufacturers offer the warranty proves that they don't expect to pay it out. And we were assuming that the fact that they don't expect to pay it out proves it must be a good pan. Well, if the opposite of A, if the negation of A were true, then the fact that they don't expect to pay it out doesn't prove that it's a good pan, right? Because if nobody ever uses these warranties anyway, then they won't have to pay it out either way, right? So that wouldn't prove anything. They might as well just put the warranty on, even if it's a terrible pan, if the opposite of A is true, because nobody cashes in on these warranties anyway. So therefore, it wouldn't prove anything. The fact that they are so boldly offering this warranty and know that they won't have to pay it out doesn't prove that it's a good pan if the opposite of A is true, because nobody cashes in on these warranties anyway. So they might as well, right? But since A is true, since the people who buy frying pans according to A, for the most part, are very serious consumers, they plan on, if the pan doesn't work, they plan on actually using the warranty. Well, that proves that the fact that they're still so confident, the manufacturer's still nonetheless so confident that they're not going to have to pay out the warranty, even though they know, even though A is true, even though the people actually will cash in on the warranty if it's not good, and yet the manufacturer is still confident, that confidence proves that the pan actually will work well or last long. Because if it didn't, then according to A, people would be cashing in on that warranty. And according to the paragraph, if that were the case, they wouldn't be offering the warranty in the first place. Very complicated, very tricky question, but hopefully this makes sense. Okay, B is very tricky, and so many people pick B on this question, and people are like, dude, how is it not B? It's perfect. How does this not strengthen the argument? So let's take a very careful look at B, and there are at least two angles from which we can prove that B does not actually make this conclusion any better. First of all, B says all of the pans currently on the market that have a warranty work at least as well as any of the pans that don't have a warranty. That doesn't tell me they work better. It just tells me they work at least as well, which literally all that means is that they work as well. That's all that B proves, is that they work as well, right? Maybe better, but it doesn't say that. It just says at least as well, which means B proves that they work at least at the same quality. That's not enough to prove the conclusion, because the conclusion says you should buy a pan with a warranty even if it means paying more. Well, why should I pay more for this pan if this other pan works at the same level and it's cheaper, right? So B does not do anything to prove this conclusion, just telling me that they work as well as the ones without a warranty doesn't tell me that I should spend more money for them, right? Why would I spend more money for them if they just work as well as the other ones? That's one reason. Another, perhaps more trivial but also important reason why B is wrong is because all it says is that they work at least as well when? At the time of the purchase, right? What's the purpose of a warranty? A warranty means you use it for a few months, a year, and then it stops working, right? And that's when you cash in on the warranty. So the fact that they work at least as well at the time of the purchase doesn't prove that I'm never going to run into problems later, right? What does the paragraph say? The paragraph mentions the possibility of them lasting long, right? So B just tells us that at the time of the purchase, they work at least as well, but it doesn't tell us anything about later, right? So for those two reasons, B does not really help us out. At the end of the day, we're left with an answer choice that doesn't actually change anything because it doesn't help us prove our conclusion that these pans are better and worth spending more money on. It just says they work at least as well, and it just says at the time that you buy them. So that's not going to be enough. Let's see if we can find a better answer. C says the more that a pan costs, the more likely it is to be covered by a warranty. That doesn't tell us anything, right? Because we're trying to prove that the warranty proves that it's a good pan, right? And that it's a pan that you should buy. So C doesn't help us correlate warranty with being a pan that's good, that is good quality, that you should buy. C helps us correlate warranty with more expensive, right? So if anything, that makes me want to avoid pans with a warranty, right? Although the paragraph did argue that even if it requires paying more, right, you should only buy pans with the warranty. C basically says it probably will require you to pay more, but it doesn't strengthen the argument that I should specifically buy those pans. It just tells me, hey, by the way, it's going to cost more. D is a far cry from strengthening our argument because it has nothing to do with the subject of the argument, warranties. D just says the most expensive pans are the ones that are most likely to work well for many years. That has nothing to do with whether they have a warranty or not, right? It doesn't really say anything. I don't know if the most expensive pans are the ones with warranties or are the ones without warranties, right? So if anything, this maybe weakens the argument because D says, no, you shouldn't look for whether it has a warranty or not. According to D, all you have to do is just get the most expensive ones. Those are the ones that are going to be the most likely to work well for many years. So D introduces a new criterion that you should use perhaps instead of looking for warranty versus not warranty. You should just look for the ones that are the most expensive, right? So if anything, it's closer to weakening the argument than strengthening it. E is about what the warranty offers or guarantees most of the time. That's irrelevant, though, to this argument because the argument is not saying you should buy pens with a warranty so that you can use the warranty, so that you can capitalize on it. It says even if you don't plan to seek reimbursement, to cash in on that warranty, you should still buy those pens. Why? Because the fact that they have a warranty proves that the manufacturer has confidence that it's going to work well, right? So the actual warranty itself and whether it provides for full satisfaction, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the actual warranty provides because this argument is geared towards someone who doesn't even plan on cashing in on the warranty. Number 16, let's try to weaken the argument. The argument says when judges don't keep strict control over their courtrooms, lawyers will frequently try to influence the verdict by using inflammatory language and badgering the witnesses, which hinders the jury's effort to reach a correct verdict. Therefore, whenever lawyers do this, it's reasonable to doubt whether the verdict is actually correct, right? Makes pretty good sense because according to this paragraph, according to the information we just read, when lawyers do this, it hinders the jury's effort to reach a correct verdict, right? And therefore, the conclusion is when lawyers are doing this, we should doubt that the verdict was actually correct. So we want to weaken this argument and we want to show, nah, there's nothing to worry about. Don't worry. Even though the lawyers are having their fun, they're doing their tactics, don't worry. The verdict probably will be correct anyway. That's the angle that we want to play with one of these answer choices. So let's take a look, see if we can find that. A is a traditional textbook trick answer. It's not going to weaken the argument. A says that sometimes court proceedings overseen by very strict judges are also known to result in incorrect verdicts. That doesn't change anything. Just pointing out that there's some outliers to the rule that I'm arguing does not disprove the rule, right? It's like if I were trying to argue that smoking makes it more likely to get lung disease, right? Telling me, well, sometimes someone doesn't smoke at all in their entire life and they still get lung disease nonetheless. That doesn't weaken the argument. Just knowing that the opposite happens sometimes does not change whether or not it makes it more likely to get lung disease if you smoke. Exact same thing here, right? The paragraph is saying when lawyers do these behaviors, when the judge loses control over the courtroom, we're more likely to reach an incorrect verdict. So telling me, well, yeah, but sometimes even if they do maintain strict control, they still don't reach a correct verdict, that doesn't change anything, right? Because, okay, fine, just because it happens sometimes doesn't mean that if the lawyers were doing their tricks and the judge was not maintaining tight control over the courtroom, maybe then it would have been even more likely to get an incorrect verdict, right? So this is just like telling me, oh, well, some people never smoke and they still get lung disease. Okay, maybe if they would have smoked, they would have been even more likely to get lung disease. They would have gotten even worse lung disease, right? So A doesn't change anything. Pointing out outliers does not disprove a general rule. B is neither here nor there. B says lawyers tend to be less concerned than judges about whether the outcomes actually are fair, right? Well, it makes sense if, according to the paragraph, if the lawyers are doing these dirty tricks to influence the verdicts, then it makes sense. But B doesn't speak to whether the tricks work or not, right? B just says, yeah, lawyers don't really care if the outcome is just. That has nothing to do with whether their tricks are going to work or not, so it doesn't affect our argument. We already know the lawyers are playing tricks, right? The question is, do we have to worry about it influencing the verdict at the end of the day or not? C is irrelevant. C says people who are influenced by inflammatory language are probably not going to admit later about that influence. What does that matter? What does it matter whether they admit it later or not? The question is it going to influence the verdict or not? Maybe 5 years when we interview these jurors, maybe they'll admit it, maybe they won't admit it, but what does that have to do with anything? So D is perfect. It's telling us exactly what we wanted to look for. It says that this courtroom behavior, this obstructive behavior that the lawyers do, it's not actually going to work if the jurors are also presented with legitimate evidence, which means even though it can hinder the jury's effort to reach a correct verdict, if they're actually given good evidence, it's unlikely to work. It's seldom effective, according to D, if they're actually presented with legitimate evidence. So D totally weakens the argument, because if they're given good evidence, they're going to reach the right verdict, according to D, right? And so therefore, according to D, nothing to worry about, right? The argument was basically saying whenever lawyers do this, then we should doubt that the verdict is correct. And D says, no, you shouldn't doubt that the verdict is correct anytime that the lawyer's doing this, because according to D, no, there's nothing to worry about. Don't worry. As long as they're given good evidence, they'll reach the right verdict. So this directly weakens the argument in the simplest way possible. E is irrelevant because whether the jurors are free of bias has nothing to do with whether this technique will work on them, right? The paragraph told us that these behaviors hinder the jury's effort to reach a correct verdict. It doesn't say only if the jury is unbiased or biased. It just says it hinders their effort to reach a correct verdict. It has nothing to do with whether they're biased or not. So E tells us that the selection of the jurors is based on assessing that they are free of bias. That doesn't change anything, because the paragraph doesn't say that the fact that they're free of bias means that this technique isn't going to work. Number 17, we're looking for a principle to justify Matteo's argument. The argument says that global warming has caused permafrost to melt under these Arctic villages, which forced the inhabitants to relocate for a great expense, and pollution from cars is a major contributor to global warming. So in other words, everything we've said so far is that the automotive industry has indirectly caused these people to face a great expense, right? Because the car industry is a major contributor to global warming, which caused the permafrost to melt, which forced all the inhabitants to relocate at great expense. So everything we've said so far, if you add it all up, is basically that the car industry has caused a great expense to these people. And the conclusion is that therefore, since that's true, the car industry should be required to help pay this expense, pay for the villagers' relocation, right? So this is a very simple support conclusion argument, right? The car industry indirectly caused a great expense to some people, and the conclusion is that therefore the car industry should help pay that great expense for those people, right? So all we have to assume is if support, then conclusion. That's the assumption here. We are assuming that if an industry indirectly causes a great expense to some people, we're assuming that that means that then they should have to help pay for that expense. That and nothing else is going to be the missing principle of this argument. Let's look for that. A is tricky, but it doesn't help us. A says industries have obligations to pay for any damage that they should have known would result. Whoever said that the car industry should have known that this would happen? Maybe they had no way of knowing. It never says that in the paragraph. It just says that because of what they did that contributed to global warming, it caused the permafrost to melt, yada, yada, yada. Maybe there was no way for them to know that. It never says that they should have known that, and therefore A does not help us prove anything. B doesn't help us. B says manufacturers should have to make goods in a way that minimizes harm to people and the environment. Okay, but that doesn't help us prove our conclusion, which is that, okay, but what if they do make goods in a way that causes damage? Should they have to pay for that damage? B doesn't say anything. B just says in the first place, they should be required to make goods in a way that minimizes harm. But that's not what our argument is about. Our argument is saying, okay, fine, they didn't do that. They didn't do B, right? They caused harm. They made cars in a way that caused harm to some people. Should they be required to help pay for that expense, or should they not? B doesn't tell us whether they should have to pay for the damage they indirectly caused or not. C doesn't help us because C says when a product causes damage, governments shouldn't be required to help pay for the damage unless the manufacturer also is required to pay. So we're not arguing about governments. The conclusion is that the car industry should have to pay. C is saying governments shouldn't have to pay unless the car industry also is required to pay. But that doesn't help us prove our conclusion that the car industry should be held responsible to pay. C just says if they are, then that's the only way that the government should also have to pay. But who's arguing anything in this argument about the government having to pay? So this doesn't help us. D, of course, is exactly what we are looking for. D says anytime an industry makes a product that contributes to expensive damage for some people, it should be liable for the damage generated by that product's use. That proves this conclusion, that the car industry should be required to help pay for this relocation, because according to D, since they manufactured a product whose use contributed to expensive damage, to this great expense to these people, according to D, that proves that they should be liable to help pay for that damage. So this is exactly what we were looking for. E says an industry that contributes to global warming should be required to help pay for resulting damage to specific communities. Okay, so far so good. I think if there was a period there, if that were the end of the sentence, that'd be great. But it's not, because it says that that should be the case only if it has a general obligation to help pay for all damage caused by global warming. What? I don't know if that's true or not. So now that just scraps the whole thing, because E limits our conclusion. E says our conclusion is true only if something else is true that I don't know if that other thing is true. I don't know if they have a general obligation to help pay for all damage caused by global warming. It never said that in the paragraph. And so therefore E limits our conclusion, right? Anytime you see an answer choice that says the conclusion is true only if something else is true, well, that doesn't help prove the conclusion true. If anything, it'll help prove that the conclusion might be false if this other thing isn't true, right? So therefore, this is no good. Number 18, what is the flaw in the argument? So a bunch of people claim that our company was unfair when it didn't give bonuses to the staff. Maybe they recalled that the company had promised that if it increased profits, the staff would all get bonuses. However, they didn't increase profits. The company's profit was smaller than it was last year, so they didn't increase profits. Clearly, then the company acted fairly. They didn't have to give bonuses, in other words. Why is that a flaw, right? If you read this very quickly, superficially, it kind of sounds like it makes sense, right? They only promised that they owed bonuses if they increased their profits, but they didn't increase their profits. Doesn't that mean that they don't owe bonuses? The answer is no, not necessarily, because if you've studied conditional logic, you know that that's not true. Just because if X, then Y never means that if not X, not Y, right? If I say, if it's raining, then it's cloudy, that doesn't mean if it's not raining, it's not cloudy, right? It could be not raining and cloudy, right? Same thing here. Just because the company said, just because it's been established that if the company increased its profits, then it should give the staff bonuses, doesn't mean that if it didn't increase its profits, that it doesn't have to give any bonuses, right? Because maybe even if it didn't increase its profits, maybe it should still possibly have to give some bonuses for some other reason. Maybe there's some other metric by which they should give bonuses, right? So just because if X then Y doesn't mean if not X then not Y. Maybe there's some other reason why they should have to give bonuses. Just because this one reason wasn't true, just because X, which would have proved Y, wasn't true, doesn't mean there isn't some other reason why they should still have to give bonuses. That is the flaw of this argument. Let's look for that in the answers. A is not true. It doesn't rely on the opinions of unnamed people without establishing that they were well informed, because those several people, those unnamed people in the first sentence, we don't rely on their opinion. We actually disagree with them, right? We're saying perhaps they recalled that the company had promised that blah, 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 blah. But the whole rest of the paragraph, the argument, that is Lindsay, the narrator, speaking. She's arguing against these several unnamed people. So we're not relying on their opinions, we're arguing against them. Quite the opposite. B is perfect. B says that this argument is flawed in that it infers that these several people in the first sentence, it infers that their opinion is false, right? They say the company acted unfairly. So in other words, it says that no, that's not true. The company did act fairly, right? That they're wrong, merely because one potential reason for those several people's opinion has been undermined, right? That one potential reason for their opinion, which is that if the company increased profits, then the staff would have to all get bonuses. So that potential reason has been undermined because the profit did not increase, right? But that doesn't mean that we can throw their opinion out. That was just one potential reason for their opinion. That was one potential reason for why the company should have to give bonuses, right? If it increased its profits, then it should have to give bonuses. But that doesn't mean, just because that one reason isn't true, that doesn't mean that if the company didn't increase its profits, then they shouldn't have to give bonuses, because maybe there were 10 things that if something else, they would have had to give bonuses. And if something else, then they would have had to give bonuses. If thing number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and maybe number 6 on the list is if it increased its profits, then they would have to give bonuses, right? So just because that one reason is not true for them having to give bonuses doesn't mean that they acted fairly in not giving bonuses, because maybe there's some other reason why they should have to give bonuses as well. That was what we said when we read the paragraph, so this is exactly what we were looking for. C is definitely not what's going on here. We're not dismissing a claim based on attributes of the people who made the claim. Irrelevant attributes? What attributes are we talking about? We're not saying that these several people are smelly or stingy or ugly or whatever. We're not saying anything about them. We're not attributing any characteristics to them and dismissing their argument based on that. So that doesn't really make sense. D does not really make sense. D says we're confusing the size with the amount by which the thing increased. I don't even know what that means in this context, right? Because the argument introduces this idea of the profits having increased versus not having increased, right? It's just a binary variable, right? And we're saying if the profits increased, then they'd have to give bonuses. And we're assuming that that means that therefore, since the profits didn't increase, they shouldn't have to give bonuses. But the size, the amount by which the profits increased versus the size of the profits, right? Those variables were not really relevant. The quantities were not relevant to this argument. Well, E is definitely backwards because E says the argument overlooks that maybe a policy can be fair even if it's not generous. Well, no, that's exactly what this person's saying. This person's saying, yeah. If you said E to this person, to Lindsay, Lindsay would say, yeah, that's exactly my point. This policy was fair even though it wasn't generous, right? Lindsay's trying to argue that the company acted fairly. And E is nonsensical because E is saying, well, yeah, but you're overlooking the possibility that maybe it is fair even though it's not generous. And she's saying, what do you mean? That's exactly what I said, that it is fair, right? So E is backwards. E would not be a flaw of this argument. E is literally what Lindsay seems to be assuming is true, not overlooking. Number 19, we want to justify the paradoxical belief of these climbers. We want to resolve the discrepancy. So what is the discrepancy? Well, it's widely known that the rescue squads serving high mountain areas with treacherous weather save many mountain climbers' lives every year. However, these climbers, here's their apparently paradoxical belief, these climbers think that the rising annual toll of deaths and injuries among climbers in these very regions can actually be reduced only by totally abolishing the rescue squads. Well, that doesn't sound like that makes sense. If the squads are saving many lives, then why on earth would the only way to reduce the deaths and injuries be to completely get rid of the squads who are saving the lives, right? Wouldn't there be more deaths if you get rid of them? So that's the question we have to answer, right? Is why would abolishing the rescue squads, why would that be good? It seems like that would cost us deaths, right? But why would that be good? Why would that be, in fact, the only way to significantly reduce deaths and injuries? So that's the question we have to answer. Why does getting rid of these rescue squads actually mean less death as opposed to more? A doesn't help us out because A says it's hard to find and train people to be on these squads. Okay, fine. But once the squads are here, why should we get rid of them? According to A, right, we had to go to great effort to recruit and train people for these squads. Why does that make me understand why we should get rid of them? And it doesn't tell me why that would save lives, right? According to A, it was hard to put this squad together. So A doesn't make me want to get rid of the squad. A makes me want to keep the squad. So that doesn't resolve their belief. Their belief is that if we get rid of the squad, it'll save lives. A doesn't tell us why that's the case. B does not help us because B is about the recording of deaths and injuries. Whereas our paragraph, these people's belief, is about actual occurrence of deaths and injuries. They claim that there actually will be fewer deaths and injuries if we get rid of these squads. B has to do with the recording of deaths and injuries, right? And it says that it tends to be more accurate if you have these squads, which means if you get rid of the squads, it'll probably be less accurate. But that doesn't mean that the actual number of deaths and injuries will go up or down. It just means the recording will be less accurate. So that doesn't help us explain these climbers' belief that the actual number will go down. C doesn't help us at all because C simply tells us that people who take a lot of risks with their lives don't expect other people to take risks to rescue them. So in other words, the people who climb these dangerous regions, according to C, probably don't expect the squads to have to take risks to save them. But that doesn't change the fact that the squads are saving their lives according to this paragraph, right? So the question still remains, why would getting rid of the squads save more lives? just because of people's expectations. That doesn't answer that question. Just telling me that they don't expect the squad to have to save their lives doesn't tell me why getting rid of the squads will actually prevent deaths and injuries. D says that the majority of the people injured or killed while mountain climbing weren't really prepared. They didn't prep properly. So it's sort of their fault, according to this. That doesn't change anything, right? Because according to the paragraph, the squads are saving their lives, right? D says, well, the reason they had those deaths and injuries, or they were in danger of death or injury, was because they weren't prepared properly. Okay, fine. That's neither here nor there, though, because the squads are still saving people's lives. So it doesn't answer the question of why getting rid of the squads would save more lives. The fact that the reason that they died or got hurt in the first place was their fault versus someone else's fault versus nobody's fault versus dumb luck, or they didn't prep properly, or whatever. It doesn't matter what the reason is. The fact is, these deaths and injuries are happening, and the squads are preventing them. So it still doesn't answer the question of why getting rid of the squads would be the right move. E is perfect because E says the lower the risk of climbing a particular region is perceived to be, the greater the number of less competent, less able climbers who actually then attempt to climb it. Ah, well, that makes sense, right? Because that means that if it seems riskier, in other words, if you take away the squads, then all these less competent climbers, right, are not going to climb the region anymore, right? And I know that if you take away these squads, the perceived risk will go up tremendously. How do I know that? Because the paragraph said it's widely known. That's why they put those words in, to make sure that E is the right answer, right? It says it's widely known. Everybody knows that the rescue squads save the lives of many mountain climbers, right? Which means if you take away those rescue squads, all of a sudden, we know that they save so many lives. So if you just take them away overnight, well, then now it looks a lot riskier, doesn't it? Doesn't the perceived risk go up a lot? And according to E, if the perceived risk goes up, then these less competent climbers are going to stay away, right? Because the lower the risk is perceived to be, the greater the number of these less competent climbers. So according to E, the only reason they're climbing this mountain in the first place, this dangerous region, is because they know the squad's got their back. So according to E, if you take away the squad, they're going to stop climbing this region. So it makes sense that that would save lives because these people that are getting into the accidents are going to stay away if you take away the squads. So E resolves everything. Number 20, what do Paula and Ashley disagree with each other about? Paula and Ashley are always getting into fights with each other, so what is it this time? Let's go ahead and read the prompts. So Paula says, Earth-like planets seem to be the rule rather than the exception, so there's probably a lot of intelligent beings on other planets. And therefore, we can expect our telescopes, our radio telescopes, to detect signs of them. Because they would basically, these aliens would basically have the same understanding of math and physics that we do, which would lead them to discover gravity and all this other stuff, and then they would develop technologies like radio communication like we have, and therefore, since they probably exist and they've probably developed things like radio communication, Paula says, we would be able to detect signs of them using our radio telescopes. Ashley says, no, not so fast. That's like saying they would inevitably have the same legal or political systems that humans do. In other words, why would you assume that they would end up with the same stuff that we end up with, right? Our science, math, and technology, says Ashley, are unique to us, to our physiology and our environment, and therefore using radio telescopes to search for aliens on other planets is a waste of time and resources. So Ashley's basically disagreeing and saying, no, you can't just assume that they have radio communication. They don't develop the same things that we develop, and therefore, no, we can't expect our radio telescopes to detect signs of them. So there's a couple points of disagreement here, right? First of all, Paula thinks that it's likely that the aliens have developed technologies such as radio communication, right? And Ashley says, no, we can't assume that they just end up with the same things that we end up with. And Paula says, therefore, we can expect our telescopes to detect them. And Ashley says, no, using telescopes to search for them is a waste of time and money. In other words, we can't expect that. So those seem to be the two areas of disagreement. Here, let's look for one of those two things, obviously, in the answer choices. A is exactly one of the two things that we mentioned they disagree with, right? Paula thinks it is probable that these aliens have developed radio communication, right? And that's why Paula says we could probably find them using our radio telescopes because they probably have developed radio communication. That's what Paula says. Ashley says, no, that's crazy. That's like saying that they would have the same legal or political systems that we do, right? Our technology is unique to us, and therefore, says Ashley, no, it's improbable. It's unlikely that these aliens have developed the same technology, radio communication, just like we have, and therefore it's a waste of money to look for them. So A is exactly one of the points of disagreement. Paula thinks it's true, Ashley thinks it's false. B is a little bit of a tricky answer because even though Ashley thinks B is false, right? Ashley thinks that it's unlikely that these aliens have the same legal or political systems that we have because Ashley basically says to Paula's argument, Ashley calls out Paula's argument by saying, no, that's crazy. That would be like saying that they have the same legal or political systems that we have. That's crazy, right? Clearly, Ashley thinks that's a crazy idea, that that's unlikely that they have the same legal or political systems that we have. The problem is Paula might also think that that's the case, right? Paula might also think that it's unlikely because Paula doesn't say anything about legal or political systems. Paula just says that it's likely that they have developed similar technology to us. And Ashley is arguing against that by saying, no, that would be like saying, says Ashley, that would be like saying that they have the same legal or political systems that we have. Paula might disagree with that. Paula might agree that yes, they don't have the same legal or political systems, but Paula might make a distinction between legal, political versus technology, right? So Paula just says they probably have the same technology as us. Ashley says, no, they don't, because that would be like saying they have the same legal or political systems as us, which means Ashley thinks they don't have the same legal or political systems, or at least that that's unlikely. Paula might agree vis-a-vis legal or political systems, right? We just know that they disagree about technology because that's what they both state their opinions on. Paula never states her opinion about legal or political systems. C is certainly not the answer because even though Ashley does say this outright, Ashley says that our technology is influenced by physiology, cognitive makeup, environment. Okay, fine, but Paula might agree with that. Paula might also agree that our technology is influenced by cognitive makeup because Paula never says either way, right? And the fact that Paula thinks that aliens have the same technology, maybe Paula thinks that those aliens have the same cognitive makeup as us. Maybe Paula agrees that yes, it is influenced by our cognitive makeup, and those aliens that have the same technology as us, maybe Paula thinks that they have the same cognitive makeup and physiology and environment as us, right? So there's no evidence for what Paula holds vis-a-vis this statement. We don't know that Paula thinks this is true or false, so it can't be the answer. D is a bit tricky because even though Paula has indicated that she thinks that D is true, that she thinks that it is likely that there are aliens on other planets, Ashley might agree. Ashley might also think that it's likely that there are aliens on other planets, right? Ashley only says that using radio telescopes to look for aliens on other planets is a waste of time and money because Ashley thinks that those aliens probably don't have the same radio telescope, radio communication technology that we have. That's Ashley's point, is that using that technology, assuming that those aliens have the same technology as us, is futile. But Ashley doesn't say that she doesn't think those aliens exist in the first place, and therefore this cannot be the answer. E is definitely not an explicit point of disagreement because we don't really know either person's opinion on this. E says scientists should spend more resources on searching for aliens. Paula doesn't say that that's true or false. Paula just says if we use our radio telescopes, we could expect that to find aliens, right? But we don't know whether Paula thinks we should spend more time and money on that. Paula just says what would happen if we did. And Ashley doesn't say that we shouldn't, right? Ashley just says, no, that would be a waste of time and money. Using radio telescopes, according to Ashley, would be a waste of time and money. But Ashley doesn't say that we shouldn't spend more time and money on the search for aliens in general, right? E has nothing to do with radio telescopes. E just says, should scientists spend more time and money on the search for aliens? Ashley says we shouldn't use radio telescopes to do that, but maybe Ashley agrees that we should spend more time and money on that search in general. And I said agrees, but I don't even know what Paula thinks about that, right? So I don't know. They could both agree with this statement. They could both disagree with the statement. We have no idea. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.